Hi, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region, and this is a video companion for my new knitting pattern, Scoodola. Scoodola is a basic hooded scarf. It is based on my pattern Hoodola, which was a hooded cowl that came out, I think, in the fall of 2024. And many of you have been knitting Hoodola, and you asked me if I would do a version with a scarf. I love Scoodola so much because what Scoodola does is it has this big voluminous hood that makes it so that if you have curly big hair like me, you don't end up crushing your hair with a hat in the winter. Scoodola is constructed very similarly to Hoodola in that you start casting on at the top of the hood and is worked seamless from the top down with Judy's Magic Cast On. And you work the hood flat, and when you get to the bottom of it, you'll be provisionally casting on stitches for each of the two scarf ends. In this video, I've got these little minis that I've made that are going to show you every step of how to knit Scoodola. I'm very excited to work on this with you. I think it's important for me to tell you that every time I refer to another video in this tutorial, I'll be linking those in a playlist that I will put below this video, and you will need the pattern to follow along with this video, and I'll give you a link to that below as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. I am happy to help you. The first thing that I want to talk with you about is materials so that you can gather those and be ready to knit your Scoodola. Okay, let's talk about everything that you need for knitting Scoodola. The first thing that we're going to talk about is yarn, because that is just as fun as knitting a project, is choosing your yarn for a project. I've got a lot of ideas on the table of yarn you can use. The yarn that I used for my first Scoodola is Miss Bab's Billow, which is a really interesting yarn. And if you look underneath the camera, you can see the fabric that it makes. And what Billow is a worsted weight yarn that is made up of like a cotton tubing. I believe they called it a cotton chainette tube that has unspun baby alpaca blown inside the tube. So it creates this like really soft and lofty yarn that makes this just really scrumptious fabric that wears really, really nicely. I'm thrilled with this yarn, and if you ever see them at a fiber festival or want to buy that online from them, it is gorgeous. I got this yarn when I was at Rhinebeck last year. So you want to use either a DK weight or a worsted weight yarn for your Scoodola. You don't want to go much heavier than that because you want this scarf to wrap around your neck really nicely and not end up being too stiff or bulky. So I did a little stash dive, and it turns out I had a lot of yarns that were a possibility for knitting Hoodola. One is a yarn that I got at Rhinebeck a few years ago that I still haven't knit with, that is a blend of merino, mohair, and sari silk. It is a DK weight yarn. I think it's going a little bit closer to worsted, like a DK worsted. And you can see that with that heather of all those pieces of sari, it would make an absolutely gorgeous fabric for a hood. Another yarn that I have that I tell you guys about all the time because I just love Kelborn Woolens and all of their yarns is Scout would be another great yarn to use for a Scoodola. That's a DK weight yarn. Another thing that you could do is go stash diving, and maybe you have some DK weight yarns that would make a gradient. So you probably end up needing almost 3 skeins of DK weight superwash to do the women's medium size Scoodola, and you could just do a gradient starting with one color and then gradiating into the other colors as you run out of one. So that would be another idea. One of my testers made a scrappy Scoodola with just like lots of bits and ends of different DK weight and worsted weight yarn that she had, and it is looking super cool. I'm excited for you all to see that one. I think she posted pictures on Ravelry, so you can see that. Finally, another idea is to hold a Surrey alpaca and fingering weight yarn together. This is leftover from one of the Into the Hoods that I knit this fall. And this yarn right here is a Surrey alpaca and silk from Fiber MacGyver. And then this dark brown is a sock yarn from Sweet Georgia. And I just held the two of them together, and you can see that it makes this overall glorious fabric. So you can feel free to hold two lighter weight yarns together to get to that gauge. And we'll talk about gauge in the next section. So that gives you an idea of yarn. Yardage is listed in the pattern, and I'm being obviously vague because right now the pattern has one size, but it will have more sizes in the future. So check the pattern to make sure that you have the yardage for the size that you're making. Other things that you're going to need are two needles of the same size, the size that you use to get gauge, and they should be 36 inches or longer. They're circular needles. You're going to also need one double pointed needle that is one size bigger than you use to get gauge, or if you want to do that attached I-cord at the end, the I-cord bind off, you could do that with the 3-stitch I-cord tool. That's up to you. I'll give you videos on how to use that below. Other things that you're going to need are 2 stitch markers. You'll need them when you're working on the hood. You might also want a removable stitch marker if you find that that might help you with the short row section, and we'll talk about that when we get there. You'll need 2 needle end stoppers. I have lots of these little silicone end stoppers in stash. Just something to keep your stitches from coming off of your needles when you are working on the I-cord bind off. And then finally, and very important, you're going to want to have 2 long lengths of stitch saver. I would make sure that your lengths are at least 36 inches long so that you have enough stitch saver and can spread it out for the scarf end. Stitch saver, if you've not used it before, is 2mm hollow silicone tubing. I'll give you a link below if you've not heard of it, that will give you a resource for purchasing it, tell you all about it. I love using stitch saver for lots of different techniques, and in Scoodola I use it for provisional cast on for the scarves once you're done with the hood. So that's everything you'll need. You might also want to have a cord lock on hand to keep your stitch saver from pulling off. Some people find that it's really useful to lock down their stitch saver once they have cast onto it, just so stitches don't come flying out when you come to pull your knitting out of your bag. So those are all of the materials you need. They are all listed on the first page of the pattern as well. So once you have gathered your yarn, the next thing that you want to do is do a gauge swatch. So let's talk about that next. Okay, so as with any project, it's important that you get gauge to have success and end up with a Scoodola that fits you. I give you 2 different gauges in the pattern. One, I give you the stockinette stitch gauge, and I also give you garter stitch gauge. I don't think that you need to knit both of those gauge swatches. If you just knit the stockinette stitch gauge and get going with the hood, I think that you'll be fine with the scarves. So the hood of Scoodola is knit in stockinette stitch, and then the scarves are knit in garter stitch, and that's why I give you both of those gauges. The pattern on page 2 gives you detailed instructions for working the gauge in stockinette stitch. Your goal is to get 18 stitches and 26 rows over 4 inches. This is the same gauge for Celtopus and Hoodola and Into the Hoods, all of my other hood designs. So it should make it pretty easy, especially if you're using a yarn that you've used for one of those projects. You'll be good to go with your gauge. In those instructions on page 2, I give you an idea of when you might need to go up a needle size or down a needle size. The gauge that I give you is blocked, so it is important after you work your swatch to block your swatch and let it dry completely before you measure it. I would say that stitch gauge matters more than row gauge, but if your row gauge is very off, you might end up wanting to add in some rows to the hood, because row gauge on the hood will dictate the height of it from the top of your hood down to your neck. If you have any questions about that as you're diving in, feel free to ask them. We are happy to help you either here or in the Ravelry group or Facebook group. Again, I'll give you links to all those below. So once you've got your gauge swatch and you are good to go with your needle size, the next thing that we get to do is talk about tips for knitting your hood. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, it's time to cast on your Scoodola. And lucky for me and lucky for you, I have a whole separate video that I made for Hoodola that shows how to do the cast on of the hood. I will definitely have that linked in the playlist if you haven't watched it before. But I want to show you what's happening with the hood right here, just so you understand this step. You are casting on at the top of the hood with Judy's Magic Cast On. And then you're going to be working long rows where you're working all the way across all of the stitches around the back of the hood and then towards the front of the hood again. So your hood is worked flat. And when you count your rows, you'll be counting them from the cast on up at the top of the hood, and you're working down this way. The first section of the hood is worked flat without any decreases. And then after you've worked that first section, you will begin to work decreases, which shapes the hood around your face a little bit, which is a really nice touch for the hood. Once you have finished working the hood, the next thing that we'll be doing is provisionally casting on stitches for the scarves. So you'll follow the pattern. If you have questions about that cast on, go ahead and watch that other video. Know that you're working from the top down and you are counting rows from the cast on. Once you have finished your hood, you are going to be ready to start working those scarves, and I'm going to show you how to do that provisional cast on next. All right, we've finished our hood, and it is time to do the scarf setup, which is a whopping 2 rows. I'm going to show you how to do that on this little mini right here. The first thing that you're going to do on setup row 1 is knit across and remove your markers as you come to them. I've knit almost to the end of the row, so I'm just finishing that row with you right now so you can see what that looks like. With the right side facing of your hood, your yarn will be coming off that last stitch on your right hand needle. And now what you're going to do is grab one of your long lengths of stitch saver right there, and you want to hold that stitch saver so that it is underneath your working yarn. So if you are looking at your project, you'll have needle, you'll have yarn, and then you'll have stitch saver. When you go to do this provisional cast on, you are casting on an odd number of stitches. So you are going to start by taking your needle tip, going in front of your stitch saver, going underneath your stitch saver, grabbing your working yarn, and bringing that working yarn up onto your needle. And now if you look right there, you'll see you have 2 stitches on your stitch saver and you have 1 stitch on your needle. So now you're going to make a yarn over onto your needle right there so that you have 2 and 2. And now you're going to continue like that, diving down, grabbing the yarn, making a yarn over, diving down, grabbing the yarn, making a yarn over, diving down, grabbing the yarn, making a yarn over, and you're going to end for your final stitch by diving down and grabbing the yarn. And that will give you an odd number of stitches. I'm not giving you a stitch count right now because in the long run, we're going to have sizes for Scoodola, and I don't want to mess you up by giving you the wrong count. But that is how you do a provisional cast on onto stitch saver for an odd number stitch count. If you don't know what a provisional cast on is, a provisional cast on is a cast on that gives you live stitches to work with later. And we want these stitches to be live because we're going to be using an I-cord bind off along them to give you that nice tidy edge along the edge of the scarf. So that is the end of setup 1. And now what I'm going to do is turn my work so the wrong side of the hood is facing me. And now I am going to go ahead and on setup row 2, I am going to knit across all of those stitches I just cast onto my needle and all of the stitches of the hood. And you will be knitting. So this is your first garter ridge going across. And we're just going to do this together because we're going to be at the end of this hood lickety split because I made a tiny little baby hood to show you how to do this. I need to give myself some more working yarn. And now, when we get to the end of the hood, we are on setup row 2. We're provisionally casting on an odd number of stitches again. So you get to see what that looks like one more time, which I think is really great. So I'm holding that long length of stitch saver underneath my yarn. So again, I've got needle, yarn, stitch saver, and I'm diving in front of the stitch saver, going and grabbing the yarn and bringing it up, and then making a yarn over on the needle. And then I'm diving down, grabbing the yarn, bringing it up, making a yarn over. I'm continuing like that. Once you get into doing this, you can get quite quick. My hands know how to do this in their sleep. And you're going to end with a dive. You are casting on the same number of stitches as you did on the other side. I wasn't counting, so this could be a little off, but it is just a little swatch, so it doesn't matter. And now you are getting ready to work the short rows. And the first thing that you're going to do is knit across until you get to 2 stitches before the end of the row. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we're going to look at how to do a wrap and turn together. Okay, you have set up your scarf and you are ready to work your short rows. The first short row has you knitting to 2 stitches before the end of the row. I use wrap and turns for my short rows because we're working garter stitch, and the wrap and turn technique hides itself beautifully in garter stitch, and you don't need to pick up any wraps to resolve your short rows when you're done. So I find them to be kind of the easiest short row and the one that hides itself the most beautifully. So I am at the point in the pattern where I'm working a wrap and turn, and I want to show you how to do that. I'm going to bring my yarn to the front of my work, and I'm going to slip the next stitch purlwise to the right hand needle. I'm going to bring my yarn to the back of my work, and then I'm going to take that stitch and put it back on the left hand needle, and then I'm going to turn my work. So what I literally just did was I wrapped the stitch and then I turned my work, which is why it's called a wrap and turn. Gotta love that. And now what I'm going to do is bring my yarn to the back because I'm going to knit to 2 stitches before the end of the needle on the wrong side row, and then I'm going to wrap and turn again. What these short rows are doing is shaping the points of the scarf at the very bottom. So after you've worked those first 2 rows, The next two rows have you knitting to 2 stitches before the last wrap and turn. And I want to show you what that looks like because that might be new for some of you. And I find it trips people up a little bit. So let me grab that step out. This is where I feel like Betty Crocker sometimes. I've got all my little step outs ready to go to show you. Ready to go in the oven. Now I want cake. Who else wants cake? All right. So I've got this step out almost ready to go right here. And I am on row 3 of the short row section 1. And you can actually see that wrap and turn right there. If you are somebody who has a very hard time seeing your wrap and turns, what you can do is go ahead and take a removable stitch marker and mark the stitch that you've worked your wrap and turn on so that you don't have to look for that little wrap. I find that you can see it really easily because there's a gap right there in between the stitch that's wrapped and the last stitch. But if you want to, you can mark with removable stitch markers to help you. So I'm on row 3 right now, and I'm knitting to 2 stitches before the last wrap and turn. So that if that is the last wrap and turn, there's the 2 stitches before the wrap and turn. And now I'm going to bring my yarn to the front. I'm going to slip that next stitch and then over to the right hand needle. I'm going to bring my yarn to the back. I'm going to slip that stitch back to the left hand needle. I am going to turn my work, and then I am going to continue back for row 4 on the wrong side row, knitting to 2 stitches before the last wrap and turn, and then I'll wrap and turn again. So if you're somebody that's having a hard time seeing those wrap and turns, right now you could mark this with a removable stitch marker or like a piece of scrap yarn or something so you know where that wrap and turn is. If you're working with like a super fuzzy floofy yarn, it might be a little harder to see those wrap and turns. So that's a trick I know a lot of people use to help them so they don't have to think about it so much. So the scarves are shaped with short rows. You're working short row, that's very hard to say, section 1 with 2 stitches in between your short rows. And then you're working short row section 2 with 3 stitches between your short rows. And that is all written out in the pattern. When you are done, that will end up looking something like this. If I just give you one section so you can see what the shaping looks like. This is the top of the hood where you cast on. You're actually working in this direction. So as you work those short rows, a short row, I don't want to rock anybody's world, but it's basically a shorter row. You're not working all the way to the end. I should have started this section with that very brilliant statement. But what you're doing is creating that lovely little tip at the end of the scarf. And when you are done, your scarves will look like this. And then you are ready to go on to the next step, which is your final 2 rows, where you will just be knitting to the end. You do not need to pick up those wraps as you knit to the end, and then you will knit across to the other end. And this piece right here, this little step out, I've knit those final 2 rows working across all of my stitches, and then you're going to cut your yarn at the end, and then you are ready to work that attached I-cord bind off. So let's go ahead and do that together. Okay, time to finish off your Scoodola. Do you remember when we went over materials, I said that you needed 2 needles of the same size? That is because right now we are going to be sliding these stitches from the stitch saver onto your needle B. If you don't have a needle B in the exact same size, you could use a smaller size. I wouldn't use a bigger size though. So the first thing that I'm going to do is we're going to be working on the left half of the scarf first. So with the hood tip pointed down right there, I'm going to go with my needle and take my stitch saver and slide all of those provisional stitches from the stitch saver onto the needle. And you'll see that I'm pulling the stitch saver, but I'm pulling the stitch saver very gently. If you pull it hard, you're just going to pull it off of the end of the needle. It kind of works once you get it going to push the needle a little bit more than pull the stitch saver. And now I've got all of those provisional stitches onto my needle. And now the next step that I'm going to do is turn this over so that I've got the wrong side facing. And then I'm going to pick up 3 stitches along the inside edge of the hood. The first stitch I pick up is actually like a purl bump right there. I find that if I pick up the 3 stitches starting from there, I have too big a gap between that first provisional stitch. So I pick up right there, and then I pick up right there, and I pick up right there. And I'm doing that with the end of needle B that has all of the provisional stitches on it. And now I am turning my work right there so the right side is facing. And now I'm going to show you how to do this with a knitting needle first, because I have a feeling most of you are going to be doing this with a knitting needle. And then I'll switch over and I'll show you how to use the I-cord tool. But lucky for you, I also have a video that shows how to do I-cord edging with an I-cord tool, so you could go ahead and watch that as well. So now I've got needle C in my right hand, which is my double pointed needle, and I am going to knit 2, and then I'm going to slip 1 knitwise, and then I'm going to knit 1, and I am going to pass that slip stitch over. And then I'm going to return all of my stitches from my right hand needle back to my left hand needle. You might find that that's looking a little loose. All you need to do is pull up your tail right there, and you'll have your tail at the end if you end up with any kind of like loosey-goosey spot right there to close things up. And now I'm going to continue doing that across, and I'm going to do it a few more times just so you can see how nice and tidy this is. I'm going to knit 2, slip 1 knitwise, and I am going to knit 1, but when you do a provisional cast on, you're going to find that every other stitch is wrapped with the left leg to the front. So I'm going to knit that through the back leg right there, and then I'm going to pass that slip stitch over. And now I'm going to take all 3 of those stitches, put them back onto the needle. And now I'm going to knit 2, and I'm going to slip 1, and then I'm going to knit 1. That stitch is presenting itself the way knit stitches normally do. And then I'm going to pass that slip stitch over and slide all 3 of those stitches back to the left-hand needle. I'm going to do one more just so you can really see what this is looking like. I'm going to slip 1. I am going to knit that. You'll see the left legs to the front, so I'm just putting the needle into the hole right there so the stitch isn't twisted, and then pass that slip stitch over and slip those stitches back. And you can see how nice and tidy that I-cord edging's looking. If I go and grab the edge of my finished Scoodola right here, you can see that lovely attached I-cord edge. Now, interestingly, I normally always use the I-cord tool for working in I-cord edging like this, but the billow, because it was so floofy and also not really elastic, it didn't have a lot of spring to it, I didn't find it the easiest to use with the I-cord tool. So I did do this with the knitting needle. But I want to show you, because I'm working with a yummy superwash yarn right now, I want to show you what it's like with the I-cord tool. So what I'm going to do is I have my 3-stitch I-cord tool. If you don't know what these are, separate videos, I'm not going to go over it right now. I'm going to take the first stitch and slide it onto the first needle, the second stitch onto the second needle, and the third stitch onto the third needle. And then the next thing I'm going to do is take that next stitch on my left hand needle and put it on to that third needle as well, or hook. And now I'm going to wrap my yarn around and I'm going to pull through, and I'm going to pull through just a little bit more so it's not too tight. And I've worked one row. And now I'm going to pick up that leg in between those two stitches. I'm going to wrap the yarn around and I'm going to pull it through. And now I'm going to go into the next stitch on the needle, wrap the yarn around and pull it through. And now I'm going to pick up that that yarn that's running in between, put that on and pull it through. You might be wondering why I'm picking up that extra row right there. It's because when you use the I-cord tool, the I-cord edge is much tighter. So I'm adding in more rows by picking up the piece of yarn in between the two stitches to add in more rows. Once you get the hang of using this I-cord tool, dude, she is so fast and easy and fun to work with, and way faster than doing this with a double pointed needle. But it takes time to learn how to use it, so you might not be in the mood for building the muscle memory to do this, and I totally understand if working with the knitting needle is easier. So if I just kind of move everything out of the way here, you can see the difference between working with the needle right there. It's just a little bit looser. It's a little bit denser right there, but because I'm adding in those extra rows, it's going to end up blocking out the same. But I think it's really important to understand the whys you would do one or the other so that you have success with this gorgeous, tidy little bind off at the end. So that's everything that I have to tell you about Scoodola. I guess actually I am a liar. So here's what's going to happen with your I-cord edging. You're going to work all the way across those provisional stitches that you put onto needle B. And then I forgot to tell you that one thing I really like to do before I go to do the I-cord bind off is put some end stoppers on the end of needle A so that those stitches don't come flying off of that needle that is written into the pattern. I just forgot to read my own pattern. Once you are done binding off all of those stitches, you will do the same bind off across all your stitches on needle A, and then you will slide these provisional stitches onto needle B and work across them with the attached I-cord bind off. And finally, at the end, you will pick up 3 stitches right along that inside edge right there of the hood and graft them to your last 3 live stitches from the I-cord. And then you are done with your Scoodola. See how I lied a little bit there? One other thing I didn't tell you about at the beginning of this video is I do give you instructions in the pattern if you want to make your scarf ends longer or shorter. So you can go ahead and follow that. You'll want to do that move when you do the cast on for the scarf. So when you do that set up row 1 and set up row 2, that's where you would adjust the length of the scarf. As written for the size that I made for myself, which is the women's medium, the scarves are about like 28 or 30 inches long. I always think of a 60-inch scarf as like the perfect length scarf. So this one's about 28 inches on each side. There's plenty enough to wrap around your neck to keep you warm and still have little tails if you want to tie them to make sure they don't come undone at all or not, or just like tuck right in. I'm so excited to see all of your Scoodolas. I can see you all doing some embroidery on these. You can incorporate color work if you want to. You can go scrappy. This is like a blank canvas you get to have so much fun with, and I can't wait to see all of them flying off of your needles. Please let me know if you have any questions. I am getting really warm wearing this while I talk to you. It's definitely for outside, not for inside. Happy knitting, everyone.